My guest at this time is Jed Babbin. He served as a Pentagon official in the administration of George H.W. Bush. He is now a columnist for the American Spectator, and he has written a column on what he sees as the conservative legacy for the late Arizona Senator John McCain. Jed sums it up by suggesting that McCain ought to be absolutely lauded for his heroism at the Hanoi Hilton and during his time in uniform, but ultimately a guy who ran as a rock-ribbed conservative turned out to be, in Jed's words, an apostate to conservatism. And Jed, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
Well, let's start and go chronologically here. Obviously, most people would understand why you would applaud McCain's heroism, refusing to leave captivity when he had the opportunity during those 5+ years that he was at the Hanoi Hilton. What stands out to you most from not only that episode, but his time in uniform overall?
Well, I mean, certainly that episode was the highlight. Of course, it was a terrible experience for him and all concerned. But I remember back when John Kerry was running for president, I had the occasion to interview about 6 POWs who were there for all or part of the time that McCain was held in the Hanoi Hilton. They shared the prison with him and the torture and the beatings. And they all told me 2 things in the same word, well, more or less the same words. They all said, I would not be alive today but for the heroism of John McCain. And number 2, please don't ask your questions too quickly because my brain doesn't work as well as it used to and I can't think that clearly. So the fact of the matter was Mr. McCain was a real hero. He, as you said, refused early release because his father was an admiral and he did not want to use that as a privilege. He broke at one time, as many other POWs did, and he recorded a propaganda broadcast that the North Vietnamese tried to use. But again, other men broke, other men did the same sort of thing, and you can't really blame John McCain for any of that. He was a hero in every respect of the word. Going on from there in his congressional career, he was elected as a rock-ribbed Reagan conservative to the Senate seat of retiring Senator Barry Goldwater, who was, of course, the high water mark for, paleo-conservatism of the 1960s. And, Mr. McCain really changed. I mean, he went for quite a while as a good conservative, as a thorough conservative. But in 2000, well, actually back in 1987 and 88, he really changed. He changed because there was the Keating 5 scandal. He and 4 other senators were investigated by the Senate Ethics Committee, and they were found to have exercised bad judgment and worse. Mr. McCain had taken all expenses paid trips to the Bahamas, thanks to this fellow Charles Keating, the owner of Lincoln Savings and Loan, and that also spurred him and the others to interfere or try to interfere with the bank regulators that were closing in on Lincoln Savings and Loan. When that savings and loan tanked, it cost the taxpayers about $2 billion. And Mr. McCain changed. He became a reformer, a quasi-liberal, and as I say in the article, an apostate of conservatism.
Let me follow up on one thing from his military career, and then I want to dive in the rest of our time into his time as a legislator. You mentioned that the POWs that you had interviewed said that they wouldn't be alive without John McCain. Why? What did they tell you?
Well, they told them that, he was suffering more than most, and that, through their tap code, they communicated via tap code between the cells and amongst each other, and he kind of kept a lot of them going. He was just a very stalwart hero. He was not in any respect someone who thought of himself before others, and, that was the kind of thing that only the greatest of the heroes can do. He was not decorated much for that. He returned in 1973, not a broken man, but he'd been so badly abused, I think he had disabilities for the remainder of his life.
Absolutely. I don't believe he could raise his arms over his head anymore. A number of other things, I'm sure, as well. Now to his legislative career, Jed, I remember talking to you many times over the years, and I don't remember too many conversations where you were more fired up than when John McCain accused the Bush administration of torture in the days following 9/11. So explain why you believe that was an errant criticism on his part and what the facts are there.
Well, thanks. It's the most strange episode of his entire legislative career. Back in the outset of the War on Terror, between 2001 and about 2003. The CIA used a bunch of techniques on terrorists who were caught in the battlefield, including waterboarding. And, at the time, let's set the stage by saying torture has been illegal in the United States since at least World War II. So we had a good law that went in about 1996, in response to the UN Convention Against Torture. It was a good, solid, clear law. In 2005, Mr. McCain decided to change it. Now, this is a man who had undergone torture personally at great length and at great physical pain, and this man changed the law so it was not clear anymore. It seemed to me that it was just a very strange thing because he added terms, his amendments. Number one, he and Lindsey Graham grandstanded it through Congress, pretending that torture had never been illegal before, when obviously it had been. And, an awful lot of people in Congress, including Nancy Pelosi, were saying, oh, we never knew they were doing this, when they obviously did. But the fact came down to when they had, for example, the waterboarding issue. Waterboarding was considered not to be torture because under the law as it stood then, it did not create lasting mental or psychological harm. That was the definition in the law. And that was a decision that the Justice Department reached on the basis of that law because hundreds, if not thousands, of our pilots and special operations troops had been subjected to waterboarding over the years, over many, many decades. And they had not suffered that sort of damage. So Justice Department said waterboarding is not torture. Well, Mr. McCain changed the law to include things like severe and inhuman and degrading treatment. So now, frankly, nobody knows what the hell the law is. And torture is probably including waterboarding, slaps on the face. I mean, Lord only knows what else. So it was very strange to me that a man who had undergone torture personally would not want the law to be crystal clear. But thanks to him, frankly, it isn't.
Jed, there's a number of other votes that have rankled conservatives over the years. For example, he opposed both versions of the Bush tax cuts. He, of course, famously gave the thumbs down to Obamacare repeal last year. He did vote against Obamacare originally. And as you point out in the column, of course, he was a frustration to a lot of conservatives on the immigration issue. So what stands out most to you among those?
Well, I think pretty much all of them. I think, the issue of taking the decisive vote against repeal of Obamacare is going to stand against Mr. McCain's memory. I think the thing that I just talked about, the very bizarre amendment to the torture law, and some of the other things he did. I mean, God bless him. I certainly revere his memory. But quite frankly, Greg, I can't recall the last time I agreed with him on anything political.
Let me try one. But around 2000, late 2006, early 2007, President Bush ordered the surge in Iraq, which was not popular, but ultimately stabilized things until we, of course, withdrew in the Obama years in 2011. McCain was one of the few who stood up for the president there. How critical was that?
Well, it wasn't critical at all. I mean, the problem is that the nation-building strategy that Bush adopted, Obama followed, and now Trump finds himself mired in, is a failure. And Mr. McCain was one of the greatest advocates of counterinsurgency /surge / nation building. And, that is, again, something that was a big misjudgment. Now, I'm not very proud of the fact that I initially supported the invasion of Iraq, but I will take some pride in the fact that I believe it was, it was probably the fall of 2002 when I was writing columns and saying that we should not do nation building. So this is the kind of thing that everybody knew was going to fail. Everybody thought it was failing, except for George Bush, John McCain, and Lindsey Graham.
Last question, Jed, the media and how they've reported on that story this week, the passing of John McCain. For many years, they gave him glowing coverage, which is usually reflective of his willingness to buck the system. Of course, there was a major exception when he was running against Barack Obama. But this week, any sort of criticism or even opposition to renaming a Senate office building seems to be anathema.
Well, of course, look, at some points in his career, Mr. McCain was acting as if the New York Times editorial board was his constituency rather than the people of Arizona. And, he sought the headlines. He got the headlines. The liberal press was very generous to him, except during the times when he was running a campaign for the presidency. And at that point, they were savaging him. And, Mr. McCain, again, God bless him, I just don't think he ever learned the lesson that those guys weren't his friends.
Quite a look back at the military and political career of John McCain. Thanks very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, pal.
Jed Babbin, former Pentagon official in the administration of President George H.W. Bush, now a columnist at American Spectator. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.